Luke, you do not yet realize your importance. You have only begun to discover your power. Join me, and I will complete your training.
Oh
With
my gosh.
divine strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy. I'll never join you! If you only knew the power of the dark side. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No,
That's right.
I am your father.
We'll call it there for now.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most probably one of the most important, but also just, like, effective moments in any movie ever.
Yeah. I would call it iconic. I mean,
Yeah.
really one of the most impactful moments of my childhood. I remember very well that movie came out in 1980. I don't remember the exact time that I saw it, but I very much remember the time period of that movie,
Yeah,
along with all
I'm
the Star
sure.
Wars movies. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
So, obviously, today we both got our, Star Wars shirts on, but we're talking Star Wars. We're talking Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, or
Yep.
Anakin Skywalker.
As
Um,
father and son.
as father and son, yeah, maybe one of the most famous father and son duos in literary history, if you wanna call it that.
That's
Um,
right.
so they've got a relatively brief relationship as father and son. It's not that much time that passes, but they give context to some extremely important questions within that dynamic. What should we sacrifice to be a good parent? How can a child's love change a parent's heart? What responsibilities do children owe their parents, especially when the parents don't fulfill their own responsibilities? So we'll get to all of that, but I was thinking we could talk about kind of three things. First is why this is such an iconic moment. What about this is so powerful? The second is the story from Vader's perspective, what the fact that Luke is his son does to his psyche, how that impacts his life, and then the opposite, right? What the story from Luke's perspective is. Basically, what do you do with an evil dad? When I was thinking about this episode today, we talked about titles a little bit, call it the Star Wars story, or what to do when your dad is an evil megalomaniac. How do you deal with that? So I thought we could jump in on the just that, like we just watched, right? Why that is such an iconic moment. I remember when, like, you've told me stories about watching these movies for the first time. How did that go for you when you were a kid? What was the reaction?
So I was born in 1970, and so when Star Wars came out, the first movie, A New Hope, I was 7. I don't think I saw it in 1977. I think I saw it probably in 1978, and I saw it at the drive-in movie theater um, in Las Vegas, and so it, absolutely blew my 7 or 8 year old mind. I can't.
I'm
It,
sure.
it, it's it's hard to sort of overstate how important that was as a childhood sort of formative experience. And of course, we all thought it was the story of Luke Skywalker. It was Luke Skywalker's story, right? It was a heroic journey. We didn't sort of know the kind of Jungian archetypal way of describing it at the time, but it was the hero's journey. It was Luke Skywalker's story. And then we found out that there was going to be a sequel. And it was one of the most important sort of anticipated things of our kind of my friends and our kind of set. It was 1980. And I remember we were living in California at the time, and we didn't go see it right away. But I remember friends going to see it, and I started hearing this rumor that there was this big plot twist that Vader was somehow Luke Skywalker's father. And I was like, that cannot be. I
There's
mean,
no
that
way.
just is no,
There's no
that's just
way.
not true. That is not true. Either they're
Yeah.
lying to me, or there's been some mistake, or that's like some sort of twisted, like that. The plot twist is they're telling us Lucas, his son, that Vader's his father, but they're gonna, like, reveal that that was a lie or something like that. And I had a real hard time with that. I mean, as a 10-year-old kid, I could not immediately accept it. And, as we've, as preparing for this for this podcast, it caused me to kind of go through like why was that so hard for
Yeah.
me to accept? I mean, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant plot device for George Lucas to come up with that. And as I did a little bit of research, I found that that was not his original idea. Initially, he initially had a different kind of Luke's father was going to be a different Force ghost. He had him in his vision as being a good Jedi that had been killed by Vader, and he was going to appear to him, and there was going to be this different father and son relationship. And then through the drafting of the script, he came up with this idea, which turned out to be one of the most brilliant parts of the Star Wars
Yeah.
story. Honestly,
Yeah, I mean, it's why it works, I think. Without that I mean, the movies are great no matter what, but without
yeah,
that dynamic, it, would not have been as poignant. I mean, the whole resolution of the series. But I love that question, why does it matter so much to us? Why were you so adamant that he could not be his father?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the expectations that we have about our parents, right? I think Luke had sort of 2 responses to that. He had disappointment because, like he said, Obi-Wan told him that his father was dead, had been killed, that he was a war hero. So, to some extent, Luke has built up this image of his father as a hero, as someone who's good, and so there's the disappointment, that that's not true. But there's also probably on a lower level, like, just horror, pure
yeah,
horror at the reality of having a cruel, manipulative, evil father, because our expectations for our parents are so far opposite to that. They're so far on
right.
the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're all faced with that. I mean, we have parents that we most of us know who our parents are. There are families in which children don't have an ongoing relationship with their parents, and sometimes there are children who don't know the identities of their parents. And we've all
Mhm.
heard of kids who are adopted and go back and find their birth parents. And maybe we can do an episode on that in the future. That would be an interesting thread to pull on. But most of us are confronted on a daily basis with the faults and the weaknesses of our parents. And when we're young, we kind of don't notice those as much. We sort of accept our parents as sort of knowing everything. And, our parents are sort of the standard. They set the standards, they know everything. I remember as a kid thinking my dad kind of knew everything. He could
Yeah.
do pretty much anything. Um, your grandpa as a car guy. And I remember thinking, oh, my dad can pretty much fix anything, any car. And, it's only later in life that I realized he was self taught and he didn't know that much, to be honest. And it was really sort of only in his older years that he became more adept at
Yeah.
mechanics. He didn't have anybody to really teach him, and his father didn't really teach him that much before he kind of disappeared. And so we're confronted with these weaknesses of our parents on a day-to-day basis, and we have to deal with those. And how do we deal with them? We can deal with them in a number of ways. We can justify them, those weaknesses. We can rebel against them. We can critique them. We can ignore them. There's a number of things we can do. And what's interesting to me about the Star Wars story is not so well, it's super interesting. Luke's initial reaction, the face he makes. I mean, the
Yeah,
close up
it's
on Luke's
so oh,
face. And that was the face I made
yeah.
when my friends were telling me, oh, yeah, Vader is Luke's father. I'm like, no, it cannot be. I made the exact same face. But then when he's in the Millennium Falcon later and he's laying on that bed, and they rescue him after he falls down the tube in Cloud City, he's laying there contemplating. He has some choices to make. Like,
Mhm.
what's he going to do about that knowledge? Is he going to ignore it? Is he going to reject Vader? Or is he going to try to save him?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and in the same sort of vein, right, he has this initial reaction that is just the idea that the heroic image he had in his mind of a father figure being so far the opposite is one level to it. But then the second too is, what does that, kind of like you're saying, but what does that mean for his own character? He Is he going to follow in his father's footsteps? Is he
Yes.
is the biology side of things, is the genetic side of things going to force him down a similar dark path? And you see that in Return of the Jedi. I mean, there's like a real I mean, growing up, I don't think I ever had this reaction to the movies because I mean, I knew the whole story by the time I was 4, but, when you first watched it and there's lots of people who talked about it online, they really thought in the final movie that there was a chance that Luke Skywalker would turn to the dark side, that he would follow his father, and he wears that black outfit, and then when he chooses good, the corner of it flips open and it's white inside.
That's right.
So there's a, horror at Vader's identity, but also fear that, will I become like him? Will I make the same mistakes that my father's made?
That's a really good point. And I actually watched Return of the Jedi. Not Return of the Jedi. I watched Empire Strikes Back last night. I told mom
Mm.
it was, I'm doing research for the
I did the same
podcast.
thing this morning. I watched Return of the Jedi.
Yeah. So I watched Empire last night, and George Lucas does a great job of foreshadowing that conflict and the sort of that knot of issues when Luke is leaving Dagobah in his X-wing fighter, and
Mhm.
then Obi-Wan Kenobi appears as a Force ghost. We're getting kind of into nerdy Star Wars territory right now, but that's okay. He appears, and Yoda's there, and they implore him not to go. That if he goes, maybe he can save his friends, but that he will undermine a lot of other things, and he risks being turned to the dark side. So they
Right.
foreshadow that very dangerous risk he's putting himself in. But Yoda does say at the end, and I noticed this, he says, remember your training, save you it can. And so I think I remembered that as a kid, like holding on to that, just being like,
He's
he
gonna be okay.
said it could save him. So maybe. But
Yeah.
that I remember that being like a very open question. Is Luke
Yeah.
gonna turn?
So here's the part where I think this gets really interesting, and we've talked about this outside a little bit, but Yoda's call is to remember his training, right? His Jedi training. But the thing that saves Luke is not his Jedi training. It's not his lightsaber skills, it's not the Force. It is, as maybe cheesy as it sounds, it's love, and it's unconditional love, which the Jedi, I mean, we know from the prequels, and those maybe weren't in George Lucas's mind when he wrote this, but Jedi don't marry, they don't have kids.
Yeah,
They, I would say, love in the same way that we talk about it now. So the
that's
thing
right.
that saves Luke, I mean, when Vader throws Emperor Palpatine down the reactor shaft in the Death Star, it's because there's this turning point because Luke refuses to give up on his dad because he loves his dad and he believes that he can be good again. So this is where I think the like emphasis of the story should be. It's not so much as fun as like being a Jedi is and having a lightsaber is and all of that kind of stuff. I think the real like power of the Star Wars story is that when you love someone, that love can, like, genuinely transform them, and that's I mean, that's a part of my belief system when it comes to my relationship with God as well. His love and our love is the thing that affects the change in our lives.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that idea, right? How can a child's love change their parent's heart? The story from the perspective of Vader. So, like you said, right? We know when we started or when the movies first come out, we think it's Luke Skywalker's story at the beginning, but then it becomes more the story of Darth Vader, becomes Anakin's story. So, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the scriptures in Malachi about children's hearts turning to their fathers and things like that. But what are your thoughts about the like, why is it important that the story shift away from Luke and towards Vader?
Yeah. No, I think those are all really good points. And just a note about whether it was in George Lucas's mind or not. I think what's really interesting about the Star Wars story, I don't think any of this was initially in George Lucas's mind, and that's a testament to the power of this kind of a narrative. That goes to these very deep themes. your Gran and I had this conversation this morning about, and I think this is often the case with great literature. The story leads the author.
Yeah.
Sometimes not the other way around. That these themes sort of came out of the author's sort of efforts to kind of tell a good tale. These themes kind of came out of it.
Discovery
Yeah,
more than an invention. Yep.
yeah. So, you refer to the book of Malachi, which is the last book in the Old Testament. And, we've referred to this in our first episode. You and I are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're Christians, and so we read Scripture and we refer to the Bible a lot. There's a particular couple of verses at the end of the Bible, very end of the Bible, that says that God will send the prophet Elijah before the coming of the Lord, before like the second coming of the Lord. And he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And in our church, we have some specific beliefs about the meaning of that. Maybe we'll get into that at some point. But for this purpose, I just want to kind of focus on the beauty of that concept, the turning of the hearts of the fathers and the children toward one another, and just the importance of that in family relations. This idea that, you know, there needs to be sort of an effort to open our hearts to one another and to recognize the importance of those relationships. And then in some ways, that also happens naturally, and it can have just this sort of redemptive power in relationships. I certainly know that there was a change that happened to me when I became a father that I had nothing to do with. I may have like thought, oh, when I become a dad, I'm going to do all these different things differently in my life. But it actually had to happen for me to understand that impact. I don't know if you had kind of a similar experience when you had River.
Yeah, and I think it's an ongoing one. I've been thinking of myself the past couple days as Darth Vader. I don't think I'm evil or a megalomaniac or a Sith, but I do make mistakes in my relationship with my kid. And like the other day, I got upset at River. She's in her screaming phase right now, so she's just yelling for no reason sometimes. And I got upset at her and I made her sad. And she said, "Daddy, you're making me sad." And it broke my heart. Like I felt so bad. And um I kinda, like, growled at her, and that scared her. I just didn't know what to do. I was like, "How do I make this kid stop screaming?" But about 5 minutes later, she came up to me and said, "Dad, I love you. We can still be friends."
Yeah. Yeah.
Her immediate willingness to forgive me, I mean, she's only 3, but I guess maybe there shouldn't be a "but" there. She's only 3, so she knows how to forgive better than anyone else.
Right.
And her immediate forgiveness, it didn't, like, make me feel better about what I had done. It did the opposite. It made me feel like I can never do this again. I can never
Yeah.
make her feel that way again. I have to be a sort of pinnacle, a paragon of kindness and stability and peace in her life because that's what she deserves.
Yeah. A kind friend, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I wrote this poem a while back and I can't find it. I tried to, but it's called Small Father, and it's about the idea of being a small father instead of a large father. And I had all these images in my mind of like a large father, someone in a high-backed chair, too focused on their external concerns to pay attention. And a small father is the person who gets down on the floor with you and plays with Legos and rolls around in the grass. And I mean, that there's good ways to be a parent. There's lots of good ways to be a parent, but I think having a kid who will communicate with me that she loves me has made me want to be closer to her and a better dad for her and more on her level, more like a child, more
Yeah.
forgiving, more kind, more peaceful.
And yet you probably will still make those
Yeah.
mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And so the beauty of it, I think, is that, the generosity that comes from childhood will continue to help you and continue to heal those wounds, at least the way I see it. And one of the things that I've found, you notice you said that you see yourself sometimes as Darth Vader. The older I get, I read and reread stories. I'm reading Beowulf again.
Mhm.
I haven't read it since college, and when I read it in college, to the extent I saw myself in any of the characters, I saw myself as Beowulf.
Yeah,
But
think
this
yeah.
time, I see myself as Hrothgar, the old king,
Yeah.
because I'm old, right? You see yourself more the older you get in the older characters, and I see and empathize more with my father, and I recognize that some of the mistakes or the difficulties or the things that I saw my parents struggle with, I recognize, you know what? I get it. I get why life was hard for them. Um, and I hope you empathize maybe with me and with mom, and some of the challenges that you may have seen us go through, or some of the weaknesses or mistakes maybe that we made. And I hope that that continues on into the next generation, and that if you and Nikki make mistakes, that your children will have that kind of mercy and grace toward you. And so it's kind of a two-way street as you make that effort as a father to be on her level, to be her gentle friend, that she will also give that kind of grace to you. And I do see some of these themes, getting back to Star Wars, I do see some of those themes come out in this story, probably unintentional, at least at first, to George Lucas, bless his heart. He gave us a story that has some of these really cool themes in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that piece that you're talking about there at the end, having it be a two-way street, right? I mentioned at the beginning that there's kind of 3 pieces to this, the second one being the story from Vader's point of view, but there's also the story from Luke's point of view, and his point of view is faith in his father. It's belief and unconditional love, and it's not, I don't think, at least from what I can tell from the story itself, right? It's not a whitewashing of his father's mistakes, but it's belief that his father can change. It's so maybe a little bit of like caveat to what we've said previously or what we've said just there. I do think it's really important to empathize with our parents and to recognize like why things are difficult for them. But this moment I had with River the other day, she also kind of held me accountable. She said, "Dad, you're making me sad." And so there needs to be in Star Wars, Luke asks Vader for his help when the Emperor has him on the ground and he's shooting lightning at him. Luke says, "Father, help me." Oh,
Yeah,
he's like, "Make the choice to be
that's right.
better.
That's
Change."
right.
So we usually think about the unconditional love and the guiding hand as being the parent to the child. But I think it can just as often be the child guiding their parent towards making the correct decisions. It's just sometimes a question of whether or not the relationship has been established that allows for that kind of communication. Do the children feel comfortable talking to their parents about that? Uh, and then also whether or not the kid themselves is good, is Luke Skywalker, right? They have to be the right person to help their parents as well.
Yeah. So what you're describing here is really kind of a mixture of both conscious choice, conscious usage of our agency, to choose to turn our hearts toward one another, right? To take
Mhm.
those opportunities to, practice love, unconditional love to one another. And that can be difficult, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a daily practice. That's not just something that magically happens. But then also having that faith and confidence that if we do make those choices, there will be that. And, in our faith, we call it something like grace that will kind of come and make up the difference. These little moments that will happen to kind of make up the difference where we may fall short.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It is a conscious effort, but no matter how conscious your effort, there's going to be times when you fall short, and so there has to be something else that comes into play that helps. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and I think maybe the hardest question for me that has come out of this, and it's whether or not this unconditional love and this faith, this belief could ever be a bad thing. So, we talked about this a little bit, but Vader dies at the end, and so he doesn't have to continue. He doesn't get that long-term redemption arc. He doesn't have to continue making the right choices, and he doesn't have to continue to be a good father. He just kind of he makes the ultimate sacrifice, right? And he saves his son and he dies for it. But if he had lived, would he have the right to, what sort of rights and responsibilities as a parent would he then have to Luke and Leia and their children? I read an interesting study recently, yesterday actually, that 27% of the US population is currently estranged from one of their relatives. So like a quarter of the people in the country. And
Wow.
some of it siblings, I think the number was 10% are either estranged from a parent or a child. But there's a good chunk of the population who they, for whatever reason, don't believe that that unconditional love or that love isn't unconditional, or maybe it's not the love, but the faith is not unconditional, and they don't continue to sort of support that worldview. Um, and there's a lot of people who say that that's healthy, that that's good, right? That you should cut people out of your life who are evil or
Yeah.
narcissistic or whatever it might be. I don't know that there's like an easy answer to this question. The most satisfying thing I've come to is that it's an individual decision to be made with as much kind of thought and wisdom as you can have. But I do think that it's an important question to consider. And I do think that, when I was a kid, I would think about Vader and Luke Skywalker and be like, yeah, they did it. He made it to the end. He changed. He became good again. But the older I get, the more I feel like it's not so much about dying for your kids, it's about living for them and, like, continuing to make the right choices. Or not necessarily for your kids, but for whatever your valued thing is. Uh, so again, yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to that, but at what point, if ever, do we remove those negative influences from our lives, and what kind of, like, rights we give to people like that? I think that's a harder question than just, what we've been talking about so far.
Well, I think it is a very thoughtful question. And I have a couple of reactions to put it in context. First of all, I mean, fortunately, in the story, Vader is sort of a genocidal war criminal. Fortunately, most of our parents are not in that category. There are
Yeah.
probably a few, hopefully none of our listeners. But you bring up the question of sort of restitution, right?
Mm,
When we're sort of talking about redemption, there's this idea of restitution. It's hard to make amends for misdeeds and for, big mistakes without sort of restoring in the balance between justice and mercy. There should be an effort to restore as nearly as possible to some balance, the wrongs that somebody has committed. And yeah, I mean, the movie I watched yesterday, I mean, he did his forced chokehold on so many people and killed them. It's
yeah,
kind of hard to come back from that.
yeah,
But fortunately, many of the things that happen in family relationships can be restored through, um, through loving, patient interaction. Some cannot, right? I mean, some cannot. I mean, there are cases of abuse where sometimes I think some sort of physical separation is needed.
yeah,
And obviously, you know, we would never want to kind of, encourage somebody to kind of put themselves in a situation where they're in danger or where they're subject to abuse. So it's an important issue for people to consider individually and with good professional advice or counseling. But I do think this issue of restitution and restoring back to some semblance of justice is an important element to all of this.
I agree. The thought that I have been having, and you had written this in our notes for this episode, was, and we mentioned it last time as well, was the story of the prodigal son. And I've been thinking about how many of the stories that we've been thinking about, the parent is the prodigal son
Yeah,
in a
he's the
lot of ways.
prodigal. Hmm.
Um, and the kid is waiting with open arms. One thing I find really interesting about that story that I hadn't thought about before is that the father in the prodigal son in the Bible is not out in the situation that the son is in. He doesn't remove himself from the safety of the home to go to the town where the kid is eating with the pigs and spending all the money and in the brothels and in the bars and things. And there's layers to this, but I do think there is this principle where the person who has been wronged stays safe, right? They stay where they are, but they wait with open arms. And if the person who has done the wrong, if Darth Vader wants to come back and make amends, then Luke Skywalker is there ready to make those amends. The best example I have of this in my life is Nikki, my wife. She is the most forgiving person I think I've ever met. And she's always willing to, like, accept any sort of restitution or amends, and it doesn't take very much. So I think that that maybe for me is the principle that I'm taking from this is that, there may be times in our lives where we have people in our families who are less than easy, and we can do our best to try to make those amends, and then we wait. And if those people come back and try to restore the equilibrium or restore that love, we need to have the ability to forgive and accept that. Of course, there are exceptions, like you mentioned, but I think that's kind of what I'm taking out of this
I
episode.
like that. I like that. I wanted to make one more point, and I thought maybe we'd do it at the beginning, but I think I forgot. But I think it does relate to this. We were talking before the show about the Mandela effect. This kind of pop culture um, concept of sort of this collective misinformation or misunderstanding of a historical fact, and it was coined. I can't remember the name of the lady who coined it, but this collective mistake about the death of Nelson Mandela in the 1980s. That's the genesis of the
Mhm.
name. He didn't die in the 1980s, but a lot of people believed he had died in the 1980s. But anyway, one of the examples of the Mandela effect is the quote from Empire Strikes Back that I have on my shirt. Luke, I am your father. He doesn't actually say that, but most people, when they quote the movie, say it like this. He doesn't say that. He says, no, I am your father, right? Um, but it made me think when we were talking about whether redemption is always a good thing, and I think it is, but also just this idea of how we remember people. Sometimes we remember only the good or only the bad. We have selective recollection about our parents. We either remember them as heroes or remember only the negative. And sometimes that says more about us than it does about them. Um, I don't know. Have you found that or do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. Um, the last part of, or one of the last parts of the Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker burns Vader's body and his armor. And we find out in the prequels that that is a Jedi funeral. They do it to Qui-Gon Jinn. So in some ways, I think the lesson from from these movies, and I think the thing that I want to remember is whether or not we deserve redemption or anyone deserves redemption is kind of not the point. No one does, right? Vader doesn't deserve a Jedi funeral. He doesn't deserve a son necessarily who loves him enough to help him redeem himself, but he gets it. And that's what I would hope for everyone. I would hope that we all have someone who would burn our body and our armor, even if we didn't deserve it, and give us um, the respect and the love that they wish we deserved. You know?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like that. Good to talk to you as always, Luke.
Yeah, this was a fun one. Can't go wrong with Star Wars.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks for listening.
Talk to you soon.